It was the day I had been dreading for 2 weeks. Deep down, I had already known the truth before I even decided to hire the investigator. Our marriage had been running on fumes for the past year, and the year before that, it had already started to crumble. But like most men who've been married for decades, I was slow to notice the warning signs. Love and trust become second nature after more than 20 years together. When things start to go wrong, when the conversations dry up and the shared routines that once defined your life together start fading away, you make an effort to fix it. You reach out. You try to reconnect, to do things as a couple again. You stay patient, believing that whatever is broken will eventually sort itself out. But then one day, you take a step back and realize you've never felt more alone in your life, even when she's sitting right beside you. And that's when the questions start creeping in. My wife, Lisa Brooks, worked 4 days a week, with Wednesdays off. Most nights, we got home around the same time and alternated making dinner. There was a time when cooking was something we did together, side by side. Lately, though, we had been cooking alone more and more. If she was making dinner, she didn't want my help. If it was my turn, she'd find something else to do, anything but be in the kitchen with me. On Wednesdays, she was usually home by the time I got back, but I started noticing something strange. She wasn't staying in. Instead, she was going out and somehow managing to get back just a little before I did. Of course, there were plenty of innocent explanations for that, but my gut told me otherwise. A married man learns to phrase his concerns carefully if he wants to avoid pointless fights. So, like always, Monday through Friday, I'd casually ask her about her day. And more, her answers became vague, full of empty words that didn't actually tell me anything. We weren't just drifting apart, she was actively pulling away. With both our kids, one boy, one girl, off at college, this was supposed to be the time for us to reconnect. We had fewer obligations, more time to ourselves. But for some reason, it wasn't working out that way. We weren't spending as much time together as I had expected, and even when we were, she always seemed somewhere else. It wasn't one big thing that tipped me off. There were no whispered phone calls, no suspicious texts, no long hours spent glued to a computer screen. Her phone was never locked, and I'll admit, I checked. I even went through her email. Our sex life hadn't disappeared either, though something about it had changed. She was there, but she wasn't really there. So what's a husband supposed to do? I had no interest in high-tech spyware, no hidden cameras, no wiretaps, no GPS trackers under her car. If she was hiding something, I figured I already had a pretty good idea where to look. That's why I hired a private investigator, a guy named Tom Madison. I kept my instructions simple: she's up to something on Wednesdays. Find out what it is. And don't get caught. That was Monday. By Wednesday, he had an answer. A week later, he had the video. And the whole thing cost me less than you'd think. They were creatures of habit. The same routine that kept them from needing to call or text each other was the same routine that made them so easy to catch. Every Wednesday, she met up with a man named Mark Miller at the Best Western by the interstate. They'd grab a meal, book a room, sleep together until they were spent, and then head home as if nothing had happened. The affair had been going on for 2 years. Which was exactly what I had suspected. How did I know? A little cash in the right hands got me a look at their billing records. Mark was always the one footing the bill. He had the money to do it. Mark Miller owned one of the biggest plumbing businesses in town. A fleet of trucks, a small army of employees. He also had a wife, one who was slowly dying of multiple myeloma. I felt for her. But Mark? He was a piece of garbage. The PI waited until he had solid proof before breaking the news to me. He knew I wanted something airtight. More importantly, he didn't trust me not to blow my cover if I got wind of things too soon. He was right. That Thursday morning, just a day after getting the video, He called me into his office to deliver the final blow. I sat there while he laid it all out, giving me every last detail. Then, without saying a word, he turned his computer screen toward me, pressed play, and walked out, leaving me alone with the evidence. And the pain. I could describe what I saw, but honestly, it would probably sound a lot more passionate than it really was. It was just two middle-aged people having sex. They undressed the way an old married couple would when going to bed for the 10,000th time, slow, familiar, almost routine. They talked about their week. They talked about their kids. They talked about how bad the traffic was getting there. They even talked about their lunch from just minutes earlier. And then they kept talking. And talking. And talking. All while casually stepping out of their shoes, peeling off their clothes, and stripping down to their uninspiring middle-aged underwear. Eventually, they embraced. Kissed. Touched all the right places. And went through the motions. Like a couple past their prime, carrying a few extra pounds, but still making an effort. Afterward, they lay together, talking some more. And when he was ready, they did it again. If they ever decided to make a career in adult films, they'd be broke and living in some dingy one-room apartment, barely scraping by. This wasn't the kind of footage that would fly off the shelves. But none of that made it any easier to watch. Because while she might not have been a porn star, she was my wife. For better or worse. Forsaking all others. Except, clearly, she wasn't. And for the first time in a long time, I finally understood my marriage. She wasn't holding back. She wasn't emotionally distant. She wasn't closed off. She was just giving all of it, all of her, to Mark. And I was nothing more than an afterthought. That Thursday night, avoiding her was easier than you'd think. She'd been avoiding me for the last 2 years. Friday played out the same way. The weekend wasn't much different. For once, her indifference actually worked in my favor. By Monday, I was sitting across from a lawyer named Brian Taylor, a guy who specialized in family law. Funny thing to call someone whose job is to rip families apart. He laid out my rights, told me what to expect. Then, I told him my plan. At first, he tried to wave me off. "You don't get it," he said. "Suing for alienation of affection is a waste of time. These cases almost never go anywhere. There's no real money in it, and you're just setting yourself up for public humiliation." I leaned forward. "You don't get how I want to do it," I said. And then, I laid everything out. Ever seen a lawyer lean in and smile? It's like looking into the mouth of a shark that just caught the scent of blood. Even I found it unsettling. "You realize that if you go through with this, you'll never see a dime?" he asked. "I know," I said. "And you'll still have to pay my bill." There was that smile again. "I know," I repeated. He exhaled, studying me for a moment. "Adam, I've had a lot of men sit in that chair, just like you. I've watched their lives go up in flames. Watched their savings vanish. And let me tell you, there's never any real justice in it. But if you can actually pull this off, I might just take your case pro bono." That was the first time I'd smiled in weeks. Once the paperwork was drawn up, both Lisa and Mark received registered letters from the law office of Turner and Taylor. The message was simple. A situation had come up that required their attention. Would they be available for a meeting on Tuesday at 10 a.m.? We picked Tuesday for a reason. We were gambling that they wouldn't bother mentioning the meeting to each other. Lisa arrived first, 9:50 sharp. Mark strolled in 5 minutes later. The secretary later told me that the look of sheer panic on their faces when they locked eyes was the highlight of her entire week. She was in on the plan and did her best not to smirk as the two of them sat as far apart from each other as possible. I walked in at exactly 10 a.m. Their confusion was almost laughable. Before Lisa could get a single word out, I simply said, we'll just be a moment. Then, without another glance in their direction, I walked straight into my lawyer's office like I owned the place. I don't think that made them feel any better. A minute later, Brian buzzed his secretary. She stood, walked to the office door, and called out, "Mrs. Brooks, Mr. Miller, Mr. Taylor will see you now." With that, she swung the door open, and the two of them shuffled in, nervous, on edge, completely unprepared for what was coming. Brian and I were already seated on one side of the conference table. And right beside us, my private investigator. The cheaters sat across from us, side by side. Lisa opened her mouth to speak, but Brian lifted a hand, cutting her off before she could get a word out. "Mrs. Brooks, everything will be explained shortly." I let my lawyer do the talking. He leaned back in his chair, his voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Brooks, Mr. Miller, I appreciate you both taking the time to be here today. As I'm sure you've guessed, we have some important matters to discuss, and my client felt it would be best to address them together." When he said my client, he glanced at me, making it crystal clear who was in control of this conversation. That single moment set the tone for the entire meeting. I'm sure by now you realize that we are fully aware of your long-running affair. But just in case you're wondering exactly how much we know, let me be clear, we know everything. We know that every Wednesday, like clockwork, the two of you meet at the Best Western off the interstate. We know that this arrangement has been going on for 2 years. His eyes flicked to Mark. For obvious reasons, you've kept this from my client. And from the looks of things, Mr. Miller, you've kept it from your wife as well. Would that be accurate? The bastard didn't say a word. No denial. No defense. Not even a twitch of acknowledgement. He just sat there, frozen, mouth slightly open, staring like a deer caught in headlights. Brian barely missed a beat. "I'll take that as confirmation." With that, he slid a manila envelope across the table to Lisa. "Mrs. Brooks, this is a petition for divorce, which will be formally filed with the local court later this afternoon. The terms are straightforward. It grants you a standard 50-50 division of assets, stipulates that the house will be sold and the proceeds split evenly, and allows each of you to retain your individual retirement accounts." He let that sink in for a moment before continuing. "There are a few additional details included, such as provisions for your children's ongoing tuition expenses. My client has generously agreed to cover those costs in full." Lisa swallowed hard, gripping the envelope with white-knuckled fingers. Brian's expression remained impassive. "Your husband is being more than fair, Mrs. Brooks. But let me be clear, if you decide to contest this divorce, we will amend the filing to cite adultery as the grounds. If that happens, your actions will be made a matter of public record." He paused, letting his words settle in. "I don't particularly care one way or the other. But my client is willing to spare you the humiliation, provided you choose to be reasonable." The silence stretched, thick with tension, until Mark finally found his voice. "What proof do you have?" His tone was sharp, aggressive, an attempt to regain some control. I guess the initial shock had worn off. Brian didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the television screen mounted at the far end of the conference table. Tom, my private investigator, picked up a remote and pressed play. A moment later, the screen flickered to life. And there it was. Lisa let out a strangled scream, slapping both hands over her face. Mark exploded into a string of curses. "This is illegal," he shouted. "You can't record us in a hotel room we paid for. I'll have your license revoked for this." Brian remained perfectly composed. "You might want to consult your lawyer regarding the specifics of the law, Mr. Miller, but I can assure you, it was nothing more than an unfortunate oversight." Mark blinked in confusion. Brian leaned forward, his tone deliberately casual. "As it happens, another client of mine had previously reserved that very same room. He unintentionally left some recording equipment behind. Understandably, he's quite embarrassed about the situation. Mark's expression darkened, but Brian kept going. In any case, Mr. Madison here, who was retained by Mr. Brooks, had one of his agents stationed in the hallway just outside your hotel room. He recorded your arrival and departure times. Tom clicked the remote again, switching to a second video. This time, the screen showed Lisa and Mark emerging from the room. Mark's hand was firmly placed on the small of Lisa's back as she smiled up at him. Her voice was clear as day. "You were exceptional today, lover. Same time next week." I didn't need to look at them to know their faces had gone pale. Brian let the silence stretch just long enough before he spoke again. "I have no doubt this evidence will hold up in court." Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. They looked like two people who had just realized their world was about to burn. Brian let out a small sigh, almost as if he were bored. "Of course, the legality of the recording is irrelevant if all we intend to do is show it to your wife, Mr. Miller." That hit its mark. Brian leaned back, waiting. Mark's shoulders slumped. His head dipped slightly. And in that single moment, we knew, he understood exactly where this was going. His voice came out quiet, barely audible. "That's blackmail." Brian didn't hesitate. "No, Mr. Miller. That's revenge." He paused for effect. "Blackmail requires an exchange. A deal. A trade. If we choose to show this footage to your wife, it won't be to gain anything." His voice turned ice cold. "It will be solely to destroy you." With that, he slid another manila envelope across the table. "Mr. Miller, this is a legal declaration notifying you of an impending lawsuit for alienation of affection. It states that you knowingly engaged in an affair with my client's wife, effectively dismantling their marriage and inflicting upon him severe emotional distress." Mark reached for the envelope with shaking hands. Lisa just sat there, motionless, her face a blank mask of horror. I watched them both and realized something. This was just the beginning. "Please, you can't do this," Mark said, his voice suddenly cracking. "My wife, she's sick. She has blood cancer. She's already weak." His eyes darted between us, desperate. "This will kill her." He swallowed hard, then leaned forward, his expression pleading. "For God's sake, have some mercy. If not for me, then at least for her. She doesn't deserve this." Brian and I exchanged a look. No words, just a silent understanding. I gave a small nod. Brian turned back to him, his voice steady. "Mr. Miller, my client is a man of integrity. He has no desire to cause your wife unnecessary suffering." He slid the envelope back toward Mark. "We will hold off on filing this lawsuit, until after she passes." Mark's relief was palpable. "But in the meantime," Brian continued, "you can keep this notice as a reminder of what's coming." I leaned across the table, lowering my voice so that only he could hear me. "You'd better take damn good care of her, you worthless bastard." Mark flinched. "Make sure every single day she's alive, she gets the best care money can buy." I sat back, letting my words sink in. "Because the longer she lives, the longer you get to keep your money." Mark looked like he was about to be sick. Which was exactly what I had hoped for. Lisa had been silent up until now. She had listened to everything, taking it all in. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she hadn't spoken a word. Now that the attention had shifted away from Mark, she finally found her voice. "Adam. I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I don't know why I did it. Mark talked me into it, and I cut her off with a shake of my head. You're going to have to do a whole lot better than that, Lisa." My voice was flat, emotionless. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This went on for 2 years. Whatever he said to convince you the first time, you were a willing participant every time after that. She looked down, twisting her fingers together. But, please, she continued, her voice trembling. The kids were off at college. You were always busy with work. And the new girls at the office, they were all so young. I just started feeling old. Mark, he made me feel alive again. He gave me excitement. She wiped at her tears. But I see now that it was wrong. So wrong. Please, Adam, let's just go home. We can fix this. I swear to you, we can. I let out a short, humorless laugh. I don't think so, Lisa. I gestured to the envelope still sitting in front of her. Sign the papers. They're fair. More than fair. Then you can go chase whatever fountain of youth you think you need. Please, think of the kids, she pleaded. We were supposed to grow old together, Adam. I exhaled, shaking my head. Just sign the damn papers, Lisa. Brian pressed the button on his desk, triggering the outer office buzzer. A moment later, the door swung open, and his secretary stepped inside. Mrs. Brooks. Mr. Miller. She gestured toward the hallway. Right this way. Neither of them moved for a second. Then, wordlessly, they stood and followed her out. As soon as the door shut behind them, Tom turned to me. You okay, Adam? I let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. Yeah, I muttered. That video you got, it did something to me. There's no going back now. Brian studied me. You still sure you want to handle Mark this way? I nodded without hesitation. Oh yeah. Like you said, there's no real money in an alienation of affection suit. I leaned back in my chair. I want something else from him. Brian smirked. I just hope he's dumb enough to walk into your trap. He was. Mark wasted no time making himself look broke. He started liquidating his assets, at least, on paper. He sold his truck and tools to his son for $1. Then, he transferred ownership of his entire company to him for another. On paper, Mark was just an employee, one who mysteriously never managed to save a dime. He sold his house to his daughter for $10 but never moved out. He wrote massive checks to his kids, draining his accounts. He even funneled his 401k into their names. Of course, it was all a sham. His kids technically owned everything, but Mark still had full access to the money. His paycheck covered the necessities, while they kicked back whatever extra cash he needed. He thought he was being clever. He thought he was safe. And for 2 years, he was. Then, his wife died. 1 week later, he was served. Mark walked into Brian's office, looking smug. This time, it was just the three of us, Brian, Tom, and me, sitting on one side of the table. Mark sat across from us, still wearing that same cocky smirk. He thought he had pulled one over on us. Brian laced his fingers together, looking calm, collected. Mr. Miller. We meet again. Mark's smirk widened. As we promised 2 years ago, we held back on filing the alienation of affection suit. Out of respect for your wife's condition. Mark didn't even blink. During that time, my client divorced his wife due to her infidelity, with you. Brian let that sink in before continuing. And now, the stakes are higher. The smile on Mark's face didn't waver. He has lost both her affection and his marriage. Brian tilted his head. And it's time to pay the piper. Mark finally spoke, his voice dripping with amusement. Good luck with that. He leaned back, still grinning like he had already won. Tom, unfazed, picked up the remote and pressed play. The same video from 2 years ago flickered onto the screen. Brian folded his hands. We've been over this before, Mr. Miller. Mark didn't flinch. For 2 years, you engaged in a weekly affair with Lisa Brooks, meeting her at the Best Western by the interstate every Wednesday. Tom let the footage play, the same damning evidence as before. Brian's voice was even, deliberate. Your actions, and your complete disregard for my client's marriage, destroyed his family. Mark just sat there, smirking. He thought he had won. He had no idea what was coming next. Because of you, his children now have parents who live apart. His grandchildren will never know what it's like to grow up in an intact family. Brian's voice was calm, almost clinical, as he laid it all out. The law allows him only financial compensation for the damage you've done, so we've set the amount at $300,000. He folded his hands on the table. You can pay us now, or we can take this to court with a higher demand, where every dirty detail of your affair will be laid out for the world to see. Mark leaned back in his chair, smirking. Go ahead. Take your best shot, he said smugly. I've got nothing for you to take. Brian didn't even blink. I wouldn't call it nothing, Mr. Miller. He tilted his head, as if mildly amused. You have a home. You have a successful business. Between those assets alone, we could recover the full amount with no issue. And if that's not enough, there's always your retirement account. Mark's smirk widened. I don't have any of those things anymore, he said. He shrugged, feigning innocence. I sold my company to my son. He grinned. I sold my house to my daughter. Another smirk. And I gave them both my retirement accounts. Cleaned them out completely. He spread his hands. I'm living hand to mouth these days. His voice practically dripped with mock sympathy. Brian remained unfazed. Well, then we can always garnish your wages. You're still working, still running the company. Mark let out a small laugh. I run it, sure, he admitted. But I don't own it. My pinhead son does. If I left him in charge, he'd just run the whole thing into the ground. He was smirking harder now, confident that he'd won. Brian nodded, as if considering something. And what about your house, he asked. Mark's smirk didn't fade. Nope. I don't own that either. My soft-hearted daughter lets me live there rent-free. He chuckled. She even gives me money. Not that you can touch it, it's all off the books. The kid does whatever I tell her. Brian glanced at Tom, who was already picking up the remote. You seem to have enough money for your other affairs, Brian said casually. Tom pressed play. The screen flickered to life. A new video. Mark's smirk faltered. Here you are, Brian continued, with Amanda Perkins, about 2 months after you ended things with Lisa Brooks. The screen switched to another clip. And here you are with Natalie McNair, about 1.5 years ago. Another clip. Megan Clarkson. Another. Olivia. Mark Miller had been a busy man. Brian exhaled. So, is that your specialty, Mr. Miller? He asked dryly. Giving bored married women a little excitement. Mark crossed his arms, regaining his composure. Tell their husbands I don't have any money for them either. Brian just shook his head. In the past 4 years, you've carried on multiple affairs, all while your wife was dying. His voice was quiet, almost disappointed. Don't you have any shame? Mark laughed. You underestimate me, Mr. Taylor. His eyes gleamed with arrogance. This world is full of unhappy wives, just like his, he said, jerking his chin toward me. I've had more than that. And it's been going on longer than 4 years. He leaned back, stretching as if he had all the time in the world. I've got what women want. And lucky for me, my wife was in no position to keep tabs on me. His smirk returned. So I did whatever the hell I wanted. Mark was enjoying himself. Sitting there, relishing his own depravity. It was his last proud moment. Because at that exact second, the office door flew open. His son and daughter stormed in. His daughter was crying. His son. His son looked ready to throw punches. The old man froze. "Dad," his daughter choked out, her voice thick with betrayal. "How could you?" His son's jaw was clenched tight. "Mom needed you," he growled, fists shaking. "And you were out screwing around." The room practically vibrated with tension. And then, chaos. "Mom was faithful to you every single day of her life. She took care of you. Cooked for you. Cleaned for you. And when she needed you the most, when she was dying, you were off chasing other women. Other married women." Mark tried to speak, but his son cut him off. "You think I can't run the company without you?" he spat. "Just watch me. I'll make it bigger than you ever could. Maybe it's time you move out of the office and go back to doing real work for a change." His daughter shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears. "Mom used to tell me that one day, you two were going to downsize. That you'd pass the house to us so we could raise our kids there, with more space." She wiped her face. "Well, guess what, Dad?" Her voice cracked. "I own that house now." Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "Looks like Mom's promise came true after all." Mark's face drained of color. He stammered, searching for words, scrambling for an excuse. But it was too late. His kids had been in the next room. They had seen everything. The videos. The confessions. All of it. His son shot him one last look of disgust before turning on his heel and storming out. His daughter followed, slamming the door behind her. Mark was left in stunned silence. And then, finally, he turned back to us. The look in his eyes was murderous. "You bastards," he snarled. "You set me up." I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Damn right we did." I'd been quiet for most of the meeting. But I wasn't about to pass up the chance to take credit for this. "You're a piece of trash, Mark." I let the words hang in the air for a moment. "You don't deserve to walk among decent men." Mark Miller, so smug just minutes ago, sat there in stunned silence. For the first time in his miserable life, he had nothing to say. "We're going to be watching you, Mark. Every step you take. If your kids ever decide to transfer ownership of that house back to you, or if they suddenly hand the company over, or return the money from your bank or retirement accounts." Brian let the words hang in the air for a moment before finishing. "We will be there to file this suit." He tilted his head, as if considering something. "And we'll make sure every husband who ever lost a wife to you gets a copy of what we found." Mark's hands clenched into fists, his jaw tightening. "In the meantime, you'll be at the mercy of your own children. You'll need to beg them for every single dime, every little scrap." I leaned forward. "And something tells me they won't be feeling all that generous from here on out." Mark pushed back from the table, his face twisted in fury. Without another word, he stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. I made a mental note to watch my back. Not because I thought he'd actually do anything. Mark was a coward, always had been. A man who slithered around behind other men's backs, preying on their wives. He wasn't the type to confront his problems head-on. Still, I wasn't taking any chances. Tom kept tabs on him for a while, checking in every now and then to make sure Mark didn't try anything stupid. But as it turned out, Mark had problems of his own. Two very interesting things happened in a short amount of time. First, he lost his cushy office job at the company he had built from the ground up. His son, who now owned the business, decided Mark was more useful doing what he used to do. So Mark found himself back in the field, crawling under houses, fixing pipes in the dust and grime, covered in sweat from sunrise to sundown. And funny enough, employee morale skyrocketed after that. Second, Mark lost his home. Not officially, of course, his daughter owned the house now, and she was finally ready to move her family in. Mark packed his bags and settled into a small, two-bedroom apartment across town. Meanwhile, his daughter and her growing family settled into the home she had spent her childhood in. Her kids had space to play, their own bedrooms, and best of all, a backyard with a pool. They loved that pool. And just to make sure Mark's kids never had a change of heart about their old man. Anytime Tom caught Mark sneaking around with another woman, he made sure to send a picture to his son and daughter. His wife had been gone for a while now, so in the grand scheme of things, it didn't really matter who he was sleeping with. But the pictures served a purpose. They reminded his kids of who their father really was. Of how he had betrayed their mother when she needed him the most. And no matter how much time passed, they never wavered in their decision to keep everything he had given them. Mark spent the rest of his days working for his son, doing the backbreaking, thankless work he had started with all those years ago. He scraped by, waiting for his social security checks to start rolling in. I never saw a dime from him. And despite Brian's promise, I did end up paying his legal bill. But as it turns out, everything evens out in the end. Because Brian ended up introducing me to his sister-in-law, Lauren, a woman who had just gone through a messy divorce with her own cheating husband. In that case, Brian actually did work pro bono. She was a few years younger than me, sharp as hell, and after a few months of dating, I realized something. Lauren was the kind of woman who genuinely enjoyed being with her man. She was affectionate, passionate. And let's just say, some mornings, it takes everything I've got just to make it to work on time. Of course, my divorce didn't go as smoothly as all of this might suggest. Lisa fought it. There was court-ordered counseling. Mediation. But in the end, I walked away free. That's the thing about being married for a long time. The moment your spouse decides they have no use for you anymore, ignores you, pushes you aside, treats you like an afterthought. The second you finally walk away, you suddenly become the most important person in their life again. But Lisa was no longer mine. She still lives in the same town, and from time to time, we run into each other. Usually at family gatherings, birthdays, holidays. For some reason, she doesn't seem to like Lauren very much. Even though everyone else in the family thinks she's great. Lauren, on the other hand, she has no problem with Lisa. In fact, every now and then, she actually thanks her. After all, if Lisa hadn't screwed up, I wouldn't be with Lauren now.